All right, so you want to really get into how AI training can be done legally, especially now that data protection laws are getting stricter all over the world.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky area.
It is a complicated landscape. So we're going to use this recent research paper called The Quest for Lawful AI Training Under Data Protection Frameworks: Global Controversies and Practical Implications to help us along.
And we'll look at some real-world examples too, right?
Right, using actual cases where authorities have clamped down on some of the big AI
That's where
developers.
it gets real.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So today, what we want to try and understand is how different countries are approaching this whole question of what is legal and what is not when it comes to training AI, especially when personal data is involved.
Right.
And we're also going to dig into those sneaky potential loopholes and gaps that are emerging as AI developers kind of push the boundaries of what's possible.
Because they're always pushing.
They are. It's almost like a cat and mouse game, isn't it? I mean, who would have predicted that Italy would temporarily ban ChatGPT?
That was a big one.
It was, or that Brazil would become like a global leader in AI regulation.
It's been wild for sure.
It really has.
One of the biggest things we're dealing with is how to apply these data protection laws, like the GDPR, which I'm sure most people listening have heard of at least,
Right.
to these new types of AI models, these generative AI models, like ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I mean, these systems are trained on just mountains of data, and they don't process information in the same way that traditional databases do.
Yeah. When I first started learning about all of this, I thought, well, surely these AI models, they aren't really processing personal data. They're just looking for patterns. But
Right.
the more I've read about how these models actually work, the less sure I am about that.
I think a lot of people have that moment where they're like, oh, wait a minute, this is more complicated than I thought. The way these large language models work, the way they tokenize and aggregate data, it's hard to say that they are not processing personal data, especially when you think about the data sets they're trained on being just full of sensitive information that can be tied back to individuals.
Right. So all of this data that's being scraped from the web.
Exactly. Think about it. Massive web scraping operations, gathering data from blog posts, social media comments, forums, even code repositories.
Wow. So even if you feel like your data is just a tiny little drop in this huge ocean, it's still in there somewhere.
It is. And when you look at recent audits of some of these really popular data sets that are used for training these models, data sets like LAI and 400M and Common Crawl, they've actually found a lot of sensitive information.
Really?
Yeah, things like names, addresses, phone numbers, even medical records.
That's concerning.
It makes it really difficult for developers to argue that they are not processing personal data.
Right. So, okay, we kind of established that these AI systems are processing personal data, at least in certain situations. So then the question becomes, what's the legal basis for doing that?
Right.
The research paper we're talking about and various regulatory guidelines point to two main legal bases: consent and legitimate interest.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
Now, on the surface, consent seems like the ideal solution, right?
Yes, in theory.
But I'm having trouble understanding how consent works at scale.
It's a real challenge.
Can you kind of break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. I think everyone agrees that consent is the gold standard.
Yeah.
We all want to be asked
Right.
before our data is used.
Mhm.
But the reality of AI development, the way it works, is that getting meaningful consent from every single person whose data might end up in these huge training data sets is basically impossible.
Right.
It's just not realistic.
Yeah, can you imagine trying to get consent from everyone whose data appears in Common Crawl?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be insane.
It would be a logistical nightmare.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, not really feasible.
Okay, so if consent isn't really a practical option, then what? The research paper suggests that legitimate interest is kind of the go-to alternative for a lot of regulators, but isn't that kind of a slippery slope?
It can be, and we're seeing that play out in real time.
Yeah.
A good example is the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. They're like the data watchdog over there.
Right.
Initially, their stance was that requiring AI developers to find other ways to do things besides web scraping was unrealistic.
Right.
So they weren't really emphasizing the necessity test for legitimate interest.
So they were giving AI companies a bit of breathing room to figure things out.
Yeah, you could say that, but that initial leniency is gone.
Okay.
Now they're demanding much stricter justification from companies,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to web scraping. They're pushing back and saying, is there really no other way to develop these systems without just taking all of this data?
So it's a much tougher stance now.
Yeah, it is.
So it sounds like this whole legitimate interest argument is being scrutinized a lot more closely now.
Oh, yeah, for
It's
sure.
not just an easy way out.
Yep, definitely not. And a perfect example of this is the case that was brought against OpenAI, the people who made ChatGPT, by Vigilante, which is Italy's data protection authority.
Right.
They really shook things up by questioning whether OpenAI's practices around data could be justified under legitimate interest.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it is.
What happened with that case? What was the outcome?
Well, the Garante didn't just talk, they took action. They temporarily suspended ChatGPT in Italy,
Wow.
and then later they hit OpenAI with a pretty big fine.
Yeah.
It sent shockwaves through the AI industry
They,
and made it clear that regulators are serious.
yeah, they're not messing around.
They're willing to go after the big players.
Absolutely. So it sounds like relying on legitimate interest as a legal basis is getting riskier and riskier.
For sure.
But what are the alternatives? Is there any kind of middle ground here?
Well, there are some interesting ideas that are starting to emerge.
Okay.
For example, some companies were trying out these things called data trusts, where user data is pooled together and managed collectively. It's like a cooperative model for owning and controlling data.
So it gives users more say in how their data is being used.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
And it could provide a clear legal framework for AI development.
That sounds promising, but I imagine it would take a lot of effort to get something like that up and running.
Definitely, it would require a lot of coordination,
Yeah.
but the potential benefits are huge.
Yeah.
Data trust could really be a way to balance the need for data with the need for privacy and control.
It's something to watch for sure.
Definitely keep an eye on it.
So speaking of things to watch, what about other countries? Is the EU leading the way on this, or are other countries taking a different approach?
It's kind of a global race right now.
Right.
Different countries are experimenting with different approaches.
Hmm.
The research paper that we've been talking about analyzed 19 guidelines from data protection authorities all over the world.
Okay.
And it's really a mixed bag, but Europe is definitely at the forefront.
Right.
A lot of European authorities are taking a very proactive stance on AI regulation.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about Brazil kind of emerging as a leader in this space. What are they doing that's different?
So Brazil's Data Protection Authority, the ANPD,
GMPD, right?
they're interesting because they're not just issuing guidelines, they're actually taking action.
Oh, okay.
They recently put some really strict requirements on Meta and X
Oh, wow.
to protect children's data and make sure that they're complying with Brazil's data protection law.
X being formerly Twitter.
That's right.
So even though these companies are based in the U.S., they still have to follow Brazil's laws if they want to do business there.
Exactly. Data protection is becoming a global issue, and regulators are starting to take a more cross-border approach.
I see.
They're realizing that data travels across borders,
Right.
and they're trying to assert their authority over how that data is used, even by companies that are based in other countries.
So it's not just about what happens within a country's own borders anymore.
No, it's not.
This tension between guidelines and enforcement is also playing out closer to home. The ICO in the UK and the DPC in Ireland are both looking into Meta's use of user data for AI training without consent.
Right. Those investigations are still going on, but they highlight a really important point.
What's that?
Data protection authorities are getting more assertive.
Yeah, they're not afraid to challenge the big tech companies.
Exactly. They're showing that they're willing to use their power.
So we've got all of these guidelines and enforcement actions popping up all over the place.
It's like a patchwork quilt.
But is it enough? Are we really addressing the challenges that AI is presenting, or are we just scratching the surface?
Well, I think the answer is probably a little bit of both.
Okay.
We're making progress, but there are still some big gaps and limitations in how we're approaching this.
Okay, so let's talk about those gaps. What are we missing? What are the biggest things that regulators are still trying to figure out?
One of the biggest challenges is that a lot of these guidelines lack operational depth.
Okay.
They talk about these high-level principles, but they don't always give clear, actionable advice that companies can easily follow.
So it's like having the rule book, but no instructions on how to actually play the game.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good analogy.
Companies are left wondering how to put these principles into practice.
Right.
And this lack of clarity can lead to inconsistent enforcement
Of course.
because different regulators might interpret the rules in different ways.
Which doesn't really give anyone a lot of confidence
No, it does.
when they're trying to navigate this whole complex landscape.
Right, and there's the issue of regulators often focusing on the low-hanging fruit.
Okay.
the most obvious violations,
Right.
instead of tackling some of the more difficult legal questions.
So what do you mean by more difficult legal questions? Give us an example.
Okay, so one area that's particularly tricky is the issue of inaccurate AI outputs.
Right, those hallucinations.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, where the AI system generates information that's wrong or even completely made up.
And it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference
It
between what's real and what's fake.
Right, so how do we hold companies accountable for these inaccuracies, especially when the AI system is basically a black box, even to the people who developed it?
Right, it's a great point. It seems like we're still figuring out the rules of the game as we go along.
Yeah, we are.
It's almost like data protection laws are always playing catch up, trying to keep pace with this technology that's constantly evolving.
You're exactly right. AI keeps pushing the boundaries, and regulators are struggling to keep up.
And it's not going to slow down anytime soon.
Probably not. Another area where we need clearer rules is the use of sensitive data or children's data in training sets.
Right?
These are really sensitive areas, and we need to make sure that there are strong safeguards in place.
Absolutely. So it sounds like the guidelines and the enforcement actions are kind of speaking different languages.
Yes, they're not quite aligned.
There's a disconnect between the theory and the practice.
Exactly, and that disconnect can create a lot of uncertainty and confusion for everyone involved.
So how do we fix that? How do we bridge this gap and make sure that the guidelines are actually useful in the real world and that the enforcement actions are consistent and effective?
Well, one thing that the research paper emphasizes is the need for better coordination and interaction between the guidelines and the enforcement actions.
I
Right now, it often feels like they're operating in separate silos.
Right.
They need to be talking to each other.
So more dialogue, more collaboration.
Exactly. We need a more integrated approach where the guidelines inform the enforcement and the enforcement provides feedback that helps to refine the guidelines.
Okay, so a kind of continuous feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly.
But all of this is happening against the backdrop of global AI development, right?
Yeah.
It's not like these companies are just operating within one country's borders.
It's true.
So how do we account for that global dimension?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Yeah.
We have data flowing freely across borders,
Hmm.
but the legal and regulatory frameworks are still very much national in scope.
All right, so we need some kind of international cooperation.
The research paper really stresses the need for stronger global collaboration and mutual recognition among authorities.
Okay.
We can't just have a patchwork of different regulations that are all pulling in different directions.
Right, it needs to be more unified.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But it sounds incredibly difficult to achieve.
It's definitely a challenge.
How do you get all these different countries with their different legal systems and cultural norms to agree on a common approach to governing AI?
It's not easy, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
We're already seeing some encouraging signs of cooperation.
Like what?
Well, for example, the EU and the US are working together to develop a shared framework for AI regulation.
Oh, interesting.
And there are ongoing discussions at the OECD and other international organizations about how to address the global challenges of AI.
So there's hope for a more unified approach.
I think so. And a more harmonized global framework for AI governance wouldn't just benefit international development.
It would also help at the local level.
Exactly. Imagine if regulators could share information, coordinate investigations, and develop common standards.
Yeah, it would make the whole process much more efficient.
Absolutely.
And it would also create a much more predictable and stable environment for AI development.
Right,
Eh.
which is good for everyone.
But I'm sure there are still some pretty big obstacles to overcome before we get to that point.
There are.
What are some of the biggest hurdles to achieving this kind of global collaboration?
One of the biggest challenges is just the sheer diversity of legal systems and cultural norms around the world.
Right. What might be okay in one country might be totally unacceptable in another.
Exactly. And then you have the political considerations.
Of course.
Different countries have different priorities when it comes to AI.
Right.
And those priorities don't always align.
So navigating those differences, finding common ground, building trust.
Yeah, it's going to be a long and complicated process.
It sounds like it, but it's a process that we need to start now.
We do. The alternative, a fragmented and inconsistent regulatory landscape, is not a good outcome.
Right? It would undermine individual rights.
Yeah.
And it could even stifle innovation in the long run.
It could. So we're at a crossroads.
Yeah, it feels like it.
The choices that we make today will have a huge impact on the future of AI and on society as a whole.
Absolutely. We need to be careful and deliberate in our approach.
I agree.
And we need to work together to find solutions that work for everyone.
Well said. This has been a really insightful conversation.
It has.
I feel like I have a much better grasp of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead.
Me too. But before we wrap up, I'd love to get your perspective on what individuals can do to protect their rights in this world that's increasingly driven by AI. I
Okay.
mean, it can all feel a little bit overwhelming, like we're just along for the ride.
Yeah, it's true. All this stuff happening with AI can make people feel a bit helpless.
Yeah.
But there are things you can do.
Okay.
The most important thing is to be informed.
Right.
Understand how your data is being used and what rights you have under the law. Don't just blindly click agree on those cookie notices or terms of service agreements.
Yeah.
Take the time to read them and actually understand what you're agreeing to.
It's amazing how many of us just click agree without even looking at those huge walls of
I
text.
know, right? But we need to be more aware.
You're right, we do.
Absolutely, knowledge is power.
I like that.
And once you know your rights, don't be afraid to use them.
Okay.
You have the right to see your data, to correct any mistakes, and in some cases, even to have your data deleted.
So if a company is using my data for AI training and I'm not okay with that, I can actually ask them to stop.
In some cases, yes. Data protection laws like the GDPR give people a lot of control over their personal data.
Okay.
Of course, the specifics will depend on where you are in the situation,
Right.
but the general idea is the same. You have a right to have a say in how your data is used.
That's good to know. Are there any resources out there that can help people navigate all of this?
There are.
I mean, it can be pretty intimidating to go up against these big tech companies all by yourself.
It can be, but there's some great resources available. Privacy advocacy groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU have a ton of information on data protection and AI.
Okay.
And then you have organizations like the Open Rights Group and Privacy International that are working to promote digital rights and privacy globally.
That's really helpful. I'll definitely be looking into those. This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener.
I'm glad.
It feels like we're standing at the edge of this whole new world with AI about to change pretty much everything.
It really does.
But it's clear that we need to be careful to make sure we're developing AI in a way that's ethical, responsible, and that respects our fundamental rights.
I completely agree. This isn't just a technological challenge.
Right. It's bigger than that.
It's a societal
Yeah.
challenge. We need to have a conversation about the kind of future we want to build with AI and what role we want it to play in our lives.
And everyone needs to be part of that conversation.
Exactly. Not just the tech people and the politicians.
Right. We all have a stake in this. Okay, so to wrap things up, can you give us a quick summary of the key takeaways from our deep dive into this complex world of lawful AI training and data protection?
Sure. I think the biggest takeaway is that data protection laws are having a hard time keeping up with how fast AI is developing.
Yeah, it's moving so quickly.
It's like a constant game of catch-up.
Right.
And we're still figuring out the rules as we go along,
But
but there's this global race to find the right balance between encouraging innovation and protecting people's rights.
it's a tough balance to strike.
It is, and finding that balance is turning out to be way more difficult than anyone thought.
Yeah.
We have these guidelines that are often too vague,
Right.
enforcement actions that aren't always consistent, and a global landscape that's still very uncertain.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as this whole AI and data protection story continues to develop?
Here's a question to think about, inspired by the research paper we've been discussing. Can data protection laws really keep up with how fast AI is developing? Or are we heading towards this messy regulatory landscape where everyone's doing their own thing and ultimately people's rights get lost in the shuffle?
That's a really important question to consider. It sounds like we have a lot of work to do to make sure that AI benefits everyone, not just a select few.
We do,
Yeah.
but it's crucial work, and it's work that we all need to be involved in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful and informative. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've included links to all the sources we talked about in the show notes.
Right?
Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.